So hello and welcome, my name is Ash Brezer, I'm editor at Landezine, and today we are joined by Günther Vogt, who needs probably no introduction in our profession. He has been an important practitioner for a couple of decades now, appreciated globally for his rich, non-linear and adventurous design approach. Initially, his education is more in the direction of botany. He later shifted to landscape architecture by studying in Rapperswil, Switzerland. After his study years, he joined Dieter Kienast, and together they ran their practice Kienast Vogt until the passing of Dieter Kienast in 1998. In 2000, Günther Vogt started his own practice, Vogt Landscape Architecture in Zurich, and slowly spread around Europe. Currently, the office also operates in Berlin, London, and Paris, and also, of course, in Zurich. He lectures extensively. This year alone, he gave nearly 20 lectures. They often comprise provocative, even radical statements, but as we live in radically challenging times, we should probably get used to radical ideas and changes of how we inhabit this world. I had the pleasure of inviting Günther Vogt recently to the Academy of Architecture in Amsterdam, where I curated a short lecture series. And Günther's lecture was titled "Ecology is Invisible." If you followed our recent articles also on Landezine, you may notice some parallels in this thinking, at least from afar, but we'll now today try to have a closer look at Günther's views and also on some recent and not so recent shifts in our profession. So, as I mentioned, there are 5 Vogt Landscape Architecture offices in 4 cities. So my first question is, where are you now, and where is the mysterious 5th office, and what happens there? And good morning, Günther Vogt.
Good morning to everybody. It's named K Studio Vogt. It's around 30-40% non-commercial project. It's about research, publishing, exhibitions, and really special project. So it's not it's very difficult to integrate this kind of projects into a normal office in the everyday work of a normal office. Therefore, we do this special project in this. It's just nearby. It's connected underneath with the office, normal office, Vogt office, where I'm sitting now. So it's a very special situation. It started when I was a professor at ETH, that we had this exchange platform for the students and the people in the office between the academic world and the professional world.
So how many books have you published now within this framework of your case studio?
I don't know exactly. It was partly from the case studio, partly from the ETH. I don't know, around 7 or 8. And it's not only about our research, about our teaching, about our project. So the last book was about Lucius Burckhardt, the anthology of landscape. What Lucius Burckhardt, it was a work he did together with students. It's a kind very interesting today, especially today, where he brings expressions like wilderness, the island, and then relevant text in the last 2,000 years to this topic. It's very interesting to read. It's not so easy to read. You have to read one chapter and then wait 3-4 months and then another chapter. So otherwise you have to fool with all this inspiration of reading.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to ecology. Your lecture was titled "Ecology is Invisible," and so because across the profession we see a lot of the same images, basically of different places, where today one gets the impression that ecology needs to be visible. It became a sort of a aesthetic category. So are we dealing with some kind of Potemkin ecologies, or is the greening of cities ecologically meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think the discipline of landscape architecture is really confronted today with so many topics. I mean, resilience, sustainability, ecology, sponge city, and every year we have a new, very important topic coming on the table. And sometimes I have the feeling that the society believes that landscape architects can save the world, and I don't think that landscape architects think it as well. So it's just not possible. But it's a bit too much what we are asked to do, but we cannot solve all problems of the world. And ecology is invisible is more coming from Lucius Burckhardt. He postulated many decades ago, design is invisible, and everybody was upset. And of course, design is invisible because there are some programmatic demands on a design, and this is not visible. And it's the same with ecology. I mean, I mentioned it in Amsterdam. One of the most beautiful landscape in Europe is Chernobyl. It's really in the city center, forest is starting to grow, and it looks beautiful with wild animals like bears, wolves, whatever. But you shouldn't go there because it's very dangerous, but not visible. And more we have this topic, the rainwater management, all these kind of things. We are asked to solve these problems, flooding and. But in reality, this ecology is not really visible. You know? So, and I think we shouldn't use it we can explain the design, what is behind our design. There is definitely ecology as well. But ecology is not telling us it's good or bad. It's just describing what's going on. Like in Chernobyl, if you have this nuclear fallout, ecology is just describing what happens. And it's not... There is more and more, it sounds like a moral institution, but ecology is not moral. It's scientific and just describing what happens.
And that's why you probably also seldom use the term nature. You use the term landscape. So is that from a similar perspective? Does it come this?
Yeah, in the last years, I really felt sometimes not really well because lose the quality of language. That means we accept that, for instance, in landscape architecture, that the language of marketing, for instance, no. So housing is near a park, is in a park, and so on. And even if there are only 3 trees, it's near a park, no. For me, and it was very important since I had students in architecture at ETH. In the beginning, it was very difficult for them to use the right language we use in landscape architecture. And that's important to have the right language. If they are confronted with the other discipline as architects, talking with landscape architects, at least they should use the right expressions, professional expressions, words. And I think language is something we are really lost in as the architects as well. So, for instance, so my students were always coming from architecture, you see, and then we stretch the space. And then I said, do you see it? How I stretch a space? And my nephew is a theoretical physician. I asked him, and then he said, no, in this sense you use, it's impossible to use. But it sounds nice. No? But I think we should really have a common language, and nature, again, nature doesn't exist in Western Europe. Even the so-called Waldsterben end 80s and early 90s, even in Switzerland, the forests were dying far away from any urban situation up in the mountains. But they were dying because they were influenced by this climate, and it's not stopping anywhere. So it's influenced by our urban activities, and what sets a little bit behind this idea of design is invisible or ecology is invisible. We should more look on what are we proposing, planning, whatever. It has consequences, and sometimes that's more important. What are the consequences of our project?
Mm-hmm. And probably also this kind of abundance of possibilities to take images that came with the expansion of the digital realm and also then social media. Our profession became more, increasingly more image oriented. So sometimes one gets an impression that the image is somehow the goal that is set at the beginning. And that, of course, tends to be a problem. You also talk about the discursive approach to the design of landscape. So design process is usually messy and fluid, but what happens, for example, in your studio after you do the analysis and before you start generating images, before you start drawing plans and so on? So what is the method at that stage?
Yeah, I see it in many universities, architecture and landscape architecture, since the number of students is growing. And then the solution is we work in teams. So 2 or 4 students together working on a design. We never did it. The research and the can be done as a group, and then it comes a program. Then every student had to decide, respecting the research they did together, what am I doing, what is the program of the site, choose the site, and so on. But then it's a work individually, one student, one project. And I think that's super important, because afterwards you are in many offices, you work in a team, but then it's very important that you have your position. You already know how to design, you did design a project, and you have a position, and that's very important. In our office, it's more or less always in a team, and we constantly discuss it, and that's a bit missing in the education, is that this aspect of the discourse. And it's not that somebody like me is designing and a chic design and then it's built. So we are constantly working on the project, and it's constantly, hopefully, getting better through the discussion and the inputs of the different team members. And what's really good is that they have a very specific knowledge after some weeks or some months of working on it. And I'm coming as an outsider and asking so-called critical question, and why is it like that? And so sometimes they are right, sometimes I'm right, and that's a very interesting exchange to discuss it. And it's not really good trained, and I missed it a bit at ETH as well, this exchange among professors about didactic and pedagogic. There was absolutely no discussion. But now that's a real problem, since my young colleagues, they grew up and live in a completely digital world. I live still in a completely analog world. And it was the same with my colleagues, the professors, that we are not living in the same world, but we have to change it into an advantage. And that's very important. It's the only method I found out is the discourse. You have to discuss.
And you also, you say you work mainly in public spaces. Why not also private? Maybe, private gardens, but then also other private kind of... You probably have private clients as well, but you refer to not working in the field of private garden, maybe.
Yeah, I mean the private gardens. Of course, we have private clients, but what is a big company? This is a kind of private client and not public. When we do a headquarter for a company, that's not in a traditional sense a public space. But yes, I mean private gardens, and I'm not against it. When I started with Dieter Kienast, we had a lot of these private gardens, and we did a really special project. And I admire the book by Sørensen, 39 different gardens on the same plot of land, the same building, and 39 different approaches. And that's really interesting. And we could do a lot of tests in these private garden jobs, a new material, but in a small scale. And then we used it in the large scale in public spaces. But the problem nowadays is to be very open-minded, it needs too much of my time. Meaning my young colleagues, they don't understand how these people live. I mean, they have a big garden, a big house, and they really don't know. And to find out what is really the specific of this specific project for these people. I mean, in the beginning, they all say, we need herbs for cooking, and then this is not a garden. And then I have to discuss with these people too. And after quite a while, they open themselves, and then they are coming with, you can't believe what these people then are telling me from the biography, really intimate things. But that's not the problem. Is I don't have the time. That's the reason. I don't mean it arrogant. It's really, if you do it in a good way, and you're really to find the specific garden for a family or a couple or whatever, it needs really time to find it out, because they don't tell you in the first 2-3 meetings what they really expect in their garden. But you have to give them a language, and that's possible.
Yeah, no, of course, I understand that completely. But on the other hand, we have this actually huge amount of land that is squeezed in between the, for example, ecological desert that is the agricultural field, and sometimes ecological desert that is the city, often. And you have all this, if we think about American suburbia, for example. You know, you have this, what I think Timothy Morton calls the Nazi lawns, just cut. So this is, when you look at it together, it amounts to quite a large piece of landscape.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, these suburbia in North America, Canada, unbelievable big. And so we worked a little bit with Dan Graham on it. So we did this exhibition on the Metropolitan Art Museum. When he was invited, he told the Met, but I would like to have a garden by Günther, and then we do a suburban garden, and my sculpture is in a suburban garden. And we had a lot of discussion, because his sculptures has always been low culture gardens, so this suburban garden, and high-end culture like Baroque gardens with mirrors and so on. And we had a lot of these discussions, and he grew up in New Jersey, and he did a wonderful publication in the 60s, Houses of America, where he documented these suburban gardens. And it was till the end of his life, it was very inspiring for him and very important. And I'm not saying this is ugly, stupid, or whatever. This is a very important. I mean, in terms of ecology, many of these suburban gardens in Switzerland, for instance, are very important for birds, for different animals. And I see it, but I have only one life, so I cannot do that. But as an inspiration, and I admire, for instance, like Bernard Lassus, these these poetic allotment gardens. What you can see in this super low class, really in the allotment gardens, you see wonderful poetic installations. And then I really look at it, and it's extremely inspiring.
Let's move on. You often also give special focus to scale in your work. The projects work on a large scale and also the smaller, immediate scale. There is often kind of a communication between contrasting scales, as if it deals with a particular within the universal in a way. In what way do shifting scales affect your design process?
Yeah, first of all, when I was a student, we only worked in the small, today I would say in the small scale, not even in the middle scale, but really small scale. A neighborhood park, a small urban plaza, but really small, and definitely not the large scale. But I think in landscape architecture, we should really look on wider landscape. What we did with the students, the whole Alps, not only in Switzerland, we were in Ljubljana, for instance, as well. So therefore, I know this territory of Ljubljana quite well, with the swamps and all these landscapes. And it was for me interesting that our students coming from architecture in the beginning, first semester, they came with, this is a plot of land and the inside is my building and then 3 or 4 trees around. And then I explained, but what is the context? I mean, you have to think in the context. And after 3 or 4 semesters, we changed completely the scale. And it was a super help for the students. For instance, we worked in all cities around the Alps, in Milan, Ljubljana, Vienna, Munich, Torino, Marseille, Lyon. And it was always in the beginning the question to the students, what is your perimeter? In the research and in the project. And the biggest, largest perimeter was in Lyon. It was larger than Switzerland. And students were able, it was always the question, what is such a metropolitan city? How does this city relate to the landscape behind, to the hinterland, this kind of Alps? And what is the relationship between the dense urbanized territory and the hinterland, the Alps? And so they really learned. It was quite interesting to see that they are really able to think in this big scale. And then it can be much more programmatic. Of course, in the end, they have a kind of design, but not very detailed. It's more a conceptual thesis about how to deal with this landscape. And the last 4 semester we did what the ETH Studio Basel had on board, Jacques Herzog, Pierre Lemeron, Marcel Meili and Roger Diener. They did a research about whole Switzerland, the so-called portrait of Switzerland, and they described around 40% of Switzerland in the Alps, it's abandoned. And it was really an explosion in Switzerland. But then we say, okay, that's true, but it's not one color for 40% of Switzerland. Let's go deeper in, and we defined, instead of landscape, paysage and paesaggio, we said it's a valleyscape. That's the scale we have to look at. Is it for hydropower? Is it for energy production? Is it for tourism? Is it for protected landscape, whatever? And really to go, but then it was the whole valley. One student had to bring a concept and an idea for the whole valley. What is it? What is the profile of this landscape? And that was, again, of course, super provocative. It was in the newspapers, but it was only how these young people, students, think about the future of our landscape. So if you have a UNESCO World Heritage with the famous Morteratsch Glacier, but in 50 years you will have only rocks and gravel. Is it still a UNESCO World Heritage without the glacier? And all this kind of discussion we try to do now, because it will come very soon, that we have to give answers. And there we found out nobody feels really responsible for this landscape. It's common land, and nobody feels really, responsible is the right word. And I mean, you cannot just protect this landscape. People living there are in Switzerland, for instance, are completely against all this protection movement, because it's their common land. They use it to hunt, whatever they do with agriculture, and they don't want to have it frozen in a specific state of the landscape. And that's really interesting. And I really encourage more landscape architects to go into this scale. I think it's very important. Besides, we started with allotment gardens, and now we are shifting to the large scale. I think it's a new topic we should really look at.
So basically, you would encourage also development in the Alps, precisely because it will be a habitable environment with the climate change as well, of course, and so. Yeah, because here, for people who are watching this and don't know, maybe, of course, Günther is in Zurich on one side of the Alps. I'm now on the other side, on the southern side of the Alps in Ljubljana. And also people here are quite against protection. But I'm afraid, for example, that if we would lift these regulations, from the Alps, that it would just go neoliberal kind of privatization. So probably this should be also well elaborated and well thought through on a political level, how to do this, not just to, you know, make another kind of a resort of private villas, because this is now the main gravity of people fighting against the protection. So I don't know in your parts if you see this more like a development of tourism and more like this empowerment of the private, or is actually a public benefit at the end as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Of course, we shouldn't give it to the liberal market, but landscape architects could work on landscape development, let's say, and instead of, for instance, I try to not use the word master plan because it's very fixed and it's not, it's always changing. You do a master plan in 5 or 10 years from now, something is changing, and then we are more interested in the survey. So let's say we have all this GIS and point cloud, we have a lot of data available, and we should give what it could be the future, and it can change. It's not fixed on like in a protected area. It can be changed if you find out in 5 years, yeah, it would be better to go more this way or this way. It's much more open, and it's not a protection, it's a kind of agreement because you have to discuss this kind of development concepts in the society, and therefore I would say it is protected by the people being part of this development concept.
You, besides your shifting scales, of course, you also work in a way in shifting scales of meaning and representation. Here, I suspect you borrow some tools from the artists, namely on one hand, because now, as we already now discussed a little bit, that we have almost an excess of landscape complexity that piled up in the decades leading to this moment. It's a kind of a hypertopia that is the landscape. For at least landscape architects, we have ecology, water, climate, biodiversity, economics, politics, poetics, and so on, production of food, consumption, material, energy, and so on. On the other hand, some of your projects seem to isolate, objectify one of these layers, one motif. Your projects, I see them as such, are always about something, not the everything. So how do you curate these scales of meaning, the complexity, the scales of message that is in a way embedded in your works, and what strategies do you borrow from art?
Yeah, first of all, for me, it's very important. We are not doing art in our office, and we are not doing architecture. We just do landscape architecture. And I think it's quite a complex topic still. So we do not extend our field into other fields or disciplines. But what I learned that for the artist, it's very interesting because I exactly know that I'm not, let's say, in concurrence, or I'm not doing art at all in our office. And so therefore it's a good base for discussions, and mainly we have discussions with these artists about what is the very famous example is when Olafur Eliasson first called me for this famous exhibition in Bregenz. Yeah, I know your work, and it was a phone call. We didn't know each other. Yeah, I know your work, and then I asked him, but what would you like to do in this art museum? And then he's, something about nature, garden, or landscape, and listen to a completely different thing. We should, and in the end, I told him you cannot use the walls. You shouldn't build a sculpture in the space. You should only use the floor, because this museum is by Zumthor is so strong, you have no chance. And then Olafur afterwards in the catalog said, Dear Peter, and then it was very difficult to do an exhibition here, but Günther helped me since he knows Swiss architects how to deal with this architecture. Zumthor was quite upset, of course. And then in the end, we showed very simple phenomena. So, I mean, it's 25 years ago. Fog in the museum was really something special. Then water in the first floor, floating water and rammed earth and all this kind of really very simple material. And it was a very successful exhibition. So we are, but what I learned, for instance, we are working with different artists together. The research is quite close to science. They are very deep and going very deep in the research. I would say even more than we are doing in our office. But science, they have a series of work, of course. For instance, Julien Charrière, he was interested in nuclear or contamination, and so he worked in Kazakhstan, in Japan, wherever you have this contamination and what happens then, or with glaciers, for instance, in Greenland, but in the Alps as well. So he can use this research for different art installations or artworks, but the scientific approach was for me in the past very surprising, and they are going deeper than we do. And I'm constantly stressing my colleagues to go a bit deeper, but it's that's what I mentioned in Amsterdam to the students. The problem of many students is they do a wonderful research, and 3 years later say, "Yeah, I did something," but they don't build up their own archive, and we build up city archives of all the, for instance, Basel, Zurich, or London, where we bring all our research together. Then everybody starting with a new project, let's say in Basel, she or he can relate to this research we already did and go deeper. No, so that's really a help, and that's a main thing I learned from the artists, and was in the beginning very surprising how deeply it's rooted in their topics they are talking about. And of course, they simplify this question, what is our problem in landscape architecture, that the society is asking too many questions, and we cannot fulfill all these demands. And as you mentioned before, what's coming, and every year something new is coming, and that's a bit the problem. And to keep the overview, what is really important, and that's what I learned from the artists, not to have too many narratives in one project.
You often talk also about the importance of walking as a kind of a part of design process. So does this has to do with the sequentiality of space in order for you to understand problems of that landscape and potentials, of course?
Yeah, of course, it's rooted in the system of Lucius Burckhardt. He was professor at ETH from 1962 to 1973, and we have this library in our case studio, and we published this book about the ontology of the landscape. But what he was criticized when he was after ETH in Kassel at the university by the dean or the director of the university, what he is doing is not scientific. So he installs Spaziergangswissenschaften or strollology as a science, walking as a science. And of course, I know Hamish Fulton or Richard Long, it's his English tradition, walking in the landscape, and the outcome is a kind of art. But again, I think it has to do with this alpine. I grew up in one of these 7 countries, the smallest one in the Alps. So we have 7 different countries, 5 different languages, but there are something in common in these countries. For instance, similarity in food, in clothes, in culture, even different languages. So walking, for instance, even if you live in Milan, it was a tradition in the past to do a walk on the weekend with the family in the mountains. It was really a tradition to use this landscape to walk. And that's perhaps for me more a personal, a biographical approach. But I think it's very important. It's a problem when I started in 2007 with my students doing a walk. The longest was a cross-section in Berlin, 28 kilometers. They really couldn't do it. I was definitely the oldest one. I was the only one not having problems. But I see it walking with my students. They are mid-20s. I mean, they really have physical problems. And then, of course, and then we wait. For instance, we did it 1 week in Basel, so France, Germany, Switzerland, different geologies, 3 different political administrative rules, and then just wait in a specific position and talk about the landscape. The students were really interested to hear. I mean, I can talk about biology, geology, landscape perception as an independent science. Meanwhile, and I think it's very important. And when we installed this new master in landscape at the ETH 2 or 3 years ago, of course, we had big rounds, 5 big rounds with people in digital, the natural sciences, more sociology and so on. And what was for me the most surprising input was coming from the geologists and botanists telling us you should teach 30% of your time outside in the real landscape, not in the university and learn things. So you should give the students more time to read, first of all. They can really self-train themselves, and then you go out and you can ask and discuss with them certain topics. And a real experience is the students today need really real experience, real landscape experience. I mean, yesterday it was raining and windy like crazy, but to see it in a landscape, and for instance, if it's very nice, the sun is shining, the photos are not so good. It should be more gray and perhaps not just before it starts to rain. Then you have the really good photos, because then the landscape is much more present than in sunlight. And this kind of experience is for me very important. And of course, if you deal with public spaces, open spaces in the city, you need this experience. What does it mean? Density, what shape of a tree? And nowadays, we are too often talking in my office. I had just yesterday a discussion about biodiversity, and I'm definitely not against it, but then my colleagues bring it on the table, and then it's only biodiversity. And then I ask, but how dense are the trees? What is the shape of the tree? Because many people don't understand the difference between a Mediterranean oak and our oaks. So this is, for these people, just not interesting. For some of them, it can be interesting. And of course, we are responsible for the biodiversity. But in the end, we shouldn't forget it's the perception is through the space we are creating.
One other thing that you mentioned also when we met in Amsterdam was that landscape architecture never really went through modernism. So that got me thinking a little bit, and I find it interesting. So I wonder, and I'd like to discuss for a few minutes that we still have, I understand, what were the vital characteristics of modernism for you? What makes someone a modernist landscape architect or work a modernist landscape architecture?
Yeah, it was. I was invited 10 days before in Amsterdam, in Uzbekistan, and it was a congress about modernism. So 15 architects, and I was the only landscape architect, and 15 architects talking about modernism. It was very interesting. But then I had to explain why was modernism of course, I always say it, and then I'll always ask my colleagues, say, no, it's not true. Then give me a good example. And it's not more than half an A4 page I have until now. And it's repeatedly coming the same, Burle Marx, Carlos Scarpa, Sørensen, and so on. But then it stops slowly. But why is it? And I think it's very difficult to explain. Mainly the architectural historians in Uzbekistan were very interested in this topic. And then I told them, but listen, look out to this park just near this Congress Center. The shape is like a French Baroque garden. And then they said, you're right. But this was built in modernism time. And I think I have a bit an idea, and I wrote a text about it many years ago when after modernism and postmodernism came, and now we have this digital revolution. But I think the problem with modernism in landscapes, there was a very short period in Germany, for instance, Leberecht Micke with the Volkspark, the People's Park in Hamburg and Cologne. But he was working with Bruno Taut and other architects, and his concept for allotment gardens relating to the social problems in 1920s after the First World War. But it's a bit too simple. But in architecture and art, it was really a revolution, I have to say. But the problem in landscape, I think, was a bit the role model was aristocratic gardens from the Baroque, or even the English landscape garden was really upper class, high class people, huge parks and castles and so on. There was no role model, I would say, and it's much slower. Our discipline is much slower. I mean, it takes time until you have a big tree, and it was not. So we didn't have then the tools to be very fast. So besides Leberecht Micke, who did some of the most beautiful parks in Germany, but then it ended with the Second World War. But it's a kind of explanation. But these theory people in Uzbekistan coming from Canada, wherever, they told me they would like to keep this exchange about this topic. It was completely new, and they agreed when we discussed. They never thought like that in landscape. And they have beautiful example in Uzbekistan in modernist architecture and very old architecture from the Silk Street period. But beautiful modernist building, but no modernist landscape. And I think there is a reason, and it's for me it's still a bit a dark side in the somebody landscape architecture working in theory should really take it on board. It's much more interesting than in this current discussion about energy landscape and so on and so on. Why did it not happen? And how did it influence afterwards the postmodernism? Or now we have a next revolution with the digital. And it's all we are always a bit behind, but I'm not criticizing all landscape architects, but I'm criticizing myself. Why is it like that? It's not so easy to explain. It's more a comment or a critique or a self-critique. It's not really a deep-rooted theoretical explanation. That has to be really rooted in theory and these discussions.
Yeah, and there are also many modernisms, with shifts from context to context. But one immediately thinks, for example, about American modernism, the Egbo, Kiley, Friedberg, all these guys. And also women. There were also women like Cornelia Hahn Oberlander, for example, also Rosa Klias as well, all these big names. But then I ran into an interview with Paul Friedberg, and he basically said the same. He didn't know exactly what modernism was at that time, and he was trying to explain it with shape and true rejection of tradition. So I was thinking maybe that landscape architecture at that time was also utilized by architects because they needed something to relate their concrete cubes to emphasize their own modernity.
Yeah, but I think your examples in North and South America, it's a completely different scale than in Europe. When you had mainly in the 60s and 50s and 60s, all these huge headquarters in the landscape. And then you cannot compare it to Europe, for instance, where you have, even Corbusier did some things describing landscape, the roof garden should be given to nature and so whatever grows there. But then in his sketches, you see it was a very traditional way of understanding urban landscape, let's say. And I was once asked to go to Chandigarh because they wanted to build in one of these open spaces, a high-rise building. So to give a lecture there to tell the people you shouldn't build a high-riser disturbs this concept. Luckily, they didn't do it. But then one of the most beautiful parks I found out is just nearby. It's built by the engineer of Corbusier. If you ever are in Chandigarh, you should ask for the so-called rock garden. And he used what today we would say reuse, all this, you find it in India everywhere. They are collecting, all this materials from the building industry no longer used. And it's beautiful. It's quite big and super poetic. And it's not on the map of Chandigarh because it was illegal. And this engineer was always afraid that if the government find it out, then he has to destroy it. But now it's a very famous park used by people, much more than the Corbusier open spaces. And it's a very interesting example in parallel, definitely not modernist, but today we would say it's a park with a reused material, but absolutely beautiful, poetic, and a narrative. It's unbelievable. But I think there are, and in North America, I know very good examples. And it was, what was this famous film, My Father the Architect, when he found out he was the son of a woman working with this architect, and she was a landscape architect. I always wondered, oh God, this guy was really good, a bit like Alvar Aalto. Some architects are really talented in landscape, but then it came out, it was her. She was an architect working in his office and hidden because of this relationship. But it was really very interesting. And I think that was the influence. It's very typical with Carlos Carpa as well. It's very strong. It's always very strongly related to the architects if you have a very good examples.
When you think about, Halprin and, all the plazas, American plazas, then I find it hard to imagine that this wouldn't be modernism, at least to my perception. Now, if you go to for example, the website of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, TCLF, they are keeping track of all the kind of modernist landscape architects doing wonderful job. But maybe now we could go on and on into this. So if you have some final thoughts on this, or otherwise for today, you're off the hook.
But again, it could be an endless discussion. When you mentioned, for instance, Halprin, where I really like his work, but you have to know that his wife was a famous series in dancing or choreography. Again, he was influenced by another discipline to come to these very good results and very good projects. It was a kind, I don't know how close it was, this collaboration, but it's obvious when you see the project. It's not really, the quality is not really visible in a drawing. You have to walk through, and then you understand there is a very special choreography behind. And then I read afterwards that she was a dance theorist, or I don't know.
So thank you so much, Günther.